So yes, this is going to be an interesting one because, well, for it to be a worthwhile question at some point, Britain, during the Age of Sail, where it's considered this romping, stomping navy, has to come close to losing naval superiority, or has to actually lose it. Unsurprisingly, it did happen. And the point of this lecture is, well, this video is slightly different than the live. Lives, I always describe them as being sort of seminar style, in that they are discursive. They are still presentations by me, whereas a true seminar would usually have the presentations being done by students, and me just leading the discussion. But, well, at least how I tend to try and run them. But when you are doing a lecture, you of course have a certain level of audience participation, but it's not quite the same. It's people listening. And that allows you to get different points across. The live was about discussing the very realities of the Age of Sail. The very real problems with having controlled the sea, naval superiority, and defining what naval superiority is, and the needs of actually how to get that across, and the limitations which come with it. And there are limitations which come with it. There are. This long patrol, well, this is the third version of the long patrol that's been recorded, and it's the one I'm probably going to use, especially if I get it done through in time, is going to be slightly different. Because whilst it is also going to discuss this question and go through this, it is also going to be about what we necessarily remember in terms of our cultural history projection. Because one of the joys you have as a historian is you get to run into a lot of cultural perceptions on a regular basis. There is the history as is remembered by everyone. It comes up a lot. Sometimes it's even right. And when I say right, I mean it's 100% correct. But that is incredibly rare. Usually it's more of a generalization, which, as we all know, with a generalization, there are exceptions. That's why it's called a generalization, not a universalization. It's a generalization. And other times, they are the product of a very strong, at the time, media, for want of a better phraseology, or discursive narrative, which took hold, framing the debate and framing the discussions. And therefore, the reality, the historical reality, is completely overlooked. One of the great ones for that is the whole fall of France. It's always the surrender monkey accusations made about the French, all that stuff. The point that's usually forgotten is that the reason the French army are caught wrong-footed is because the French government had been so scared the French army might rebel against them, they had not invested in decent radios and communications. So the French army fall apart in terms of communication capabilities. But the French army also fall apart because they've had lack of funding for exercises. However, this turns into a different meme as well. There are people who then go, well, no, it's not the French army's fault because the fall of France or everything like that, because the German army's unstoppable. The German army was not unstoppable. At no point, if you look at several times in these supposed unstoppable campaigns, they get stopped. Sometimes it's by people fighting, sometimes it's by their own logistics, and the fact that many of their commanders seem to think logistics is something which happens to other people. It's the joy of it. The German army is not romping, stomping, all conquering in this period, and the French army is not ineffectual or terrible. It's crippled. And the French government had possibly some reason to fear the French army, because if you consider some of the generals they had in there in the 1920s were a bit interesting, to say the least. And the trouble is with France, it had constant political turmoil due to the trauma of World War One. And the thing is, this is all cultural memory. And then you get into other countries and they have their opinion about their history, and it features and it becomes de facto. But it's not necessarily the truth. And so when we start talking about Royal Navy, the Royal Navy and age of sail and naval superiority, you have to define so many things to A, work out what you're discussing, and B, work out a period when it's actually the case that they have naval superiority to lose. That's what we're discussing in this point. But it does mean that I am going to be confronting a few of those cultural, historical positions. And I thought I'd warn you at the beginning. I know some of the comments are coming. What I always love with the comments on YouTube is that, well, some are interesting. I occasionally have fun with the comments under the channel because, well, I realise how I sound. I realise what I am. I am a British naval historian. British is where I am. It's my nationality. So, I, to an extent, have grown up in those biases. But I've also spent a lot of time confronting them and dealing with them. Because you have to. When I was writing this book, one of the first things you come up with against is the fact that the destroyers are, to an extent, forgotten. I was doing a recording recently, and it was a very interesting program, and it's going to be a wonderful program, but it's about a battle in World War II. And they produced all these sources, these wonderful sources written by wonderful historians, to, you know, so that anyone who's commenting, so that any of the people who are going to be talking to camera would be informed and would have an idea. Not a single one of the sources they listed from eminently historians' published books had listed the destroyers correctly. Not a single one. They had all the capital ships, cruisers, fine, perfect. They even had the aircraft carrier, the right aircraft carrier. Although one of them did call it an Ark Royal class, and it wasn't. The only Ark Royal class was Ark Royal. We'll leave that to one side. And these books are not as old as I'd like them to be. And even, frankly, it wouldn't be no excuse. But the destroyers were just either not listed at all, they just said 6 destroyers. Or they didn't name them. Or if they did name them, they just were incorrect. And that's, to an extent, cultural history, but that's because the small ships are forgotten. Because they don't matter in that narrative. In that narrative, they're not that important. I remember having a long discussion with someone about Operation Claymore, which came up in this book. Operation Claymore is a really, really cool operation. It's one of the first commando raids. First commando raid, officially. And, well, they were telling me that there were battleships and cruisers involved and all sorts of things doing this operation and landing these troops. And they weren't. I know they weren't. They were destroyers sent in with some converted ferries. And they were listing off all these ships. And they didn't mention the destroyers at all. And I was going, where are you getting this from? Well, of course they're part of it. They're part of the overall force. And I went into the force lists, and I went into the archives. Looked in a minute. You're talking about distant covering forces. None of them are there. Well, if you have a battleship and a cruiser, you might as well have that there. And I'd actually had this discussion then later on with another person who just didn't realise that they'd split up. They listed destroyers as well, though, so that was fine. But this person had presumed that because battleships and cruisers were there, the destroyers didn't matter, and they didn't take part. When in fact, in Operation Claymore, the cruisers and the battleships are one far, far away. They're no more part of the operation than stuff based in Scotland was, because they are back there in a supporting role. If an enemy surface force really came out in heavy form, yes, they would probably come and engage them. So if, one of the German capital ships had been dispatched to try and attack the surface force, the commando force, they would have been deployed to deal with them. But as it was, they were not anything to do with the operation when it was actually being enacted. So that's what you have to deal with. So let us get into this. Well, ground rules. In order to lose something, you have to have it in the first place. Which meant that the very easy thing for me to point to would have been the Medway raid. And I was tempted to point to the Medway raid. It would have been so fun and so easy to point to the Medway raid. Just not possible, because it's too early. Whilst the Royal Navy might claim, and some historians I have seen do claim that the Royal Navy ruled the waves in that period, they didn't. It was at best contested sea control for anyone. At worst, it was the Dutch. Occasionally the French, with the British being strong enough that neither side really, really dominated it. And the British coming in on regular occasions and being fairly strong, but again, they had constant issues of funding. One of the interesting things that happens, and is sort of happening in this period, is that slowly, and especially after the Medway raid, the British have been professionalising and regularising the funding of the Royal Navy. And building up the infrastructure. And building upon the infrastructure. And infrastructure is not just physical things. It's not just having a dry dock. It's having people who use it. Who can, who not use it, but who know how to use it. And can make sure it's used properly so that when the ships come in, they are properly repaired. They're not just in there looking good, looking pretty. So these are useful things. But it takes time. Medway raid in 1667 is probably about, I would argue, about 75 to 100 years too early. Okay. So then are we talking about losing global naval superiority or local? Because again, this thing matters. If we're talking about the Caribbean, naval superiority there could change week in, week out in some periods, depending on how many ships have turned up in the recent convoy, and how many ships have left in the other recent convoy. It's constant. Or are we talking about something like naval superiority at home? Well, that's a different matter entirely. Because you can argue from the period of the formation of the Western Squadron, the Royal Navy never loses superiority in the Channel. You can argue. There are periods, people are going to go, well, on that day they have this issue. But from pretty much the Western Squadron going onwards, the Royal Navy is obsessed and has layers upon layers. They often have a Western Squadron and a Channel Squadron. And they have ships just bothering around. They are obsessed with the Channel. It often has far more force than they probably actually need there, because of their fear of invasion across the Channel. the wooden wall. Well, the wooden wall would go spread down the English Channel. That's where it was. This is where it comes to, you know, the apparent loss of superiority that was Byng's loss when he failed to relieve Majorca in 1756. That's the point, you know, he gets executed. It encourages other admirals and these things. It's never happened again since, although admirals have been dismissed. But the point is, and this is the legitimate point going on, did the British really have a massive naval superiority in that war to claim that? Well, I'd argue that actually the 7 Years' War is when they sort of get there. So 1756, Majorca, Byng. But by 1759, when you have the Battle of Quiberon Bay and you have Admiral Clarke leading the Western Squadron, it's very hard to argue that Britain is not a de facto naval power, is not the de facto naval power at that point. What's happened in that roughly 100 years since the Medway raid? A humongous amount of infrastructure, a tremendous amount of professionalization in terms of the admirals, and and the naval officers as a whole, and a tremendous amount of development of the naval service. However, it is not yet at level embedded enough, even at this point in the 7 Years' War, that it cannot be mucked up by an idiot. The idiot I'm going to be talking about in a bit is Lord George Germain. Universally requested as proof that the British Empire is more of an accident of history than a plan. That usually distresses a few people. But no, once you realise the level of average British minister and some of the people who were made Commonwealth Empire ministers and Dominion ministers of various things at various points, you realise very quickly that if they had a cunning plan, it was a Baldric level cunning plan. And so, yep, most of the British Empire is acquired more by accident than by intent. Thirdly, okay, it needs to be some sort of significant losses for them to actually be justifiable as losing control of the sea. For example, in the War for Austrian Succession, which is 1744 to 48, that's often pointed to. You know, Britain loses ships. It's terrible. Britain during that war loses 14 ships of the line, roughly 7 frigates, 28 smaller ships, and 3,238 merchant vessels, plus 1,012 guns. Roughly 7,000 sailors. The trouble is, Spain and France combined lost 23,000 sailors. 37 ships of the line. 23 frigates, at least 20 smaller ships, possibly more. Probably a lot more. 3,561 merchant vessels and 2,288 guns. Ouch, that sounds painful for the French and the Spanish. So yes, basically what you're dealing with there is none of the sides really has sea control, or the power, the full control and status of the sea. So it's shifting, but at no point does it really shift enough for any side to suddenly go, we now have the strength, as it does to an extent during the 7 Years' War, where at the end of that the British really have achieved a level of superiority in strength and standing. And again, naval superiority, naval power is as much about image as it is about reality. That's always something fun as a historian to say, because it's like when we're talking about the soft dimension of ship simulation. So, for example, in my recent Lion class video, I did a lot of ship simulations in using Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. And I like to use that system because it enables me to function some sort of level of veterancy into the crews to account for their specific individualities. Although you cannot factor in for all the soft power status, for example, as well, both me and my friend Drac would say the same thing, and many other historians do say the same quote, and it's a fun one. It turns up so often. Is HMS Warspite and HMS New Zealand both have what is called the living version of plot armor. We're not sure how it is, but if you want ships that actually prove that luck is a factor in war, a good example is at Battle of Narvik, HMS Warspite going in. The amount of German U-boats which are trying to aim up and fire on her and fail. The torpedoes fail, they're in positions. One bashes headfirst into a rock in the fjord and basically gets stopped that way. It's just... that ship is the living embodiment of plot armor, okay? You can't factor that into a simulation. So any simulations you do, and you know, the soft power thing of the crew training quality, the fact that they have an Admiral Lee, a Ching Lee in charge, or they have a Dalrymple Hamilton for whom the idea of a speed limit on your ship is for other people. All these officers, all these people, these crew, have a bearing on the quality of a ship. It's like when I talk about USS Texas, and I go, when I was talking about her, I go, I would never bet against Texas. I wouldn't bet on her in a fight against, let's say, the Bismarck, if she'd come on her and it was a one-on-one fight somehow in the Middle Atlantic. But I also wouldn't bet against her, because it is the USS Texas, and that ship has enough character to sink many battle fleets. So you can sit there and go, all the quantifiable facts, all the hardcore stuff, the stats, it's supposed to be Bismarck, and I will agree with you. But I also say there is an X factor here, which is the Texas, her crew, the way they think of themselves, the ship itself as a sort of a psyche in a way, and therefore you have to put an asterisk by, statistically, this ship should win. But, and there's always again the freak shots. And again, the freak shots have an impact in the age of sail. We like to believe they don't, but some ships do literally get hit by one salvo and go up because of powder being somewhere where it's not supposed to. Wooden ships are paranoid about powder and where it's placed. And yet, sometimes, life happens. Sometimes it just happens. So, as you've guessed, the war I'm talking about is the American Revolutionary War. And this is a really interesting thing because people will often go, well, you know, where did the British lose sea control? They lose sea control not because of actually any one battle. They lose sea control. They lose the power, status sea, because of the cumulative effect of this American Revolutionary War and Lord George Germain's policies. Because Germain, in charge of the Colonial Office, sets himself up in competition with the Admiralty. And because of the other officers he holds, because of his informal power in government, he basically has a blanket... Well, he has full free spending power of the government. He can spend what he likes, when he likes, at any point. So, and authorize those expenditures. So, he keeps disrupting the procurement systems which have been in place and were set up have been set up over years and proven during the 7 Years' War, etc. He keeps going his own way. The Admiralty want to convoy supply ships. He will have them sail solo. The Admiralty like to do closed tender. He'll do open bidding. It's just constant things. And as a result, the Admiralty finds itself in competition with its own government for supplies. And the American Revolutionary War starts off in 1775. It's going 3 years by the time the French and other powers join in. And that's a really bad thing for the Royal Navy, because for 3 years the Germain has been pushing more and more of his political cronies into positions of power and influence in North America. He's been selecting people increasingly on their, well, not even partisan politics. He doesn't even agree with all the people in the same party as him. He wants people who are going to agree with him and do what he wants them to. And he's a fan of big ideas which will cause maximum impact for minimum money. Especially if it'll show up the Admiralty, because that's run by Lord Sandwich, who he doesn't like, because Sandwich is the opposite of Germain. Sandwich is a workaholic, play hard, party hard. He has all sorts of fun with gambling and other things, so yes, that's often what people will point to with him. And I would agree, it is part of him, but he's also a workaholic. The man will be quite happily will work 10 days straight, pretty much 24 hours a day, putting even my functioning insomnia and my colleague Naval, or frankly any British political leader for the last 300 years, to shame with those hours. And then when he feels the crisis is done and dealt with, and usually it is by that point, he will go off for about 4 or 5 days and have a massive non-stop party, and then turn back up in the office. He's an interesting character. Politically not as well connected as Sandwich, politically not as well connected as Germain, Germain, who'd when been a general, had of course been ordered and from the field at Minden and cashiered for being a coward. So yes, really who you want to lead, who even your king had at the time had decided was an idiot and shouldn't be entrusted with his armies. In a war, or rather taking the decisions. So the British are in a problem when it comes to the Anglo-French War. They've had this dividing and this constant debating and these constant issues in terms of what Germain wants to do versus what everyone else is trying to do. And usually there's constant fighting. And disruption in dockyards, disruption almost every part of the British war effort is disrupted by Germain's practices, because he's absolutely sure that what everyone else is doing must be wrong. But as the war goes on, and you have losses, followed by draws, uneasy draws, things start to come to a head. The British government start to realise that, frankly, well, when I say the government, the British political class, the wider political class, start to realise there are big problems going on here. And very quickly, it's decided the problem is not necessarily Admiralty, because people start looking at what's going on. And the trouble is, with Germain, is he's a undoubted self-publicist. He does love to talk about himself and his practices, and he loves to gloat with friends loudly in gambling rooms and coffee houses about how he's pulled one over on the Admiralty. And the trouble is, whilst that would these days would probably be that kind of talking out of turn would probably be the product of newspaper discussions. The big problem was in this period is that most of the other people in the room listening to you at that time were other members of the government, were connected with them. And they'd be going, hang on, we're in a war here, and you're seeming to spend more time and enjoying more trying to disrupt the Navy than you are in fighting a war. We've got a global war going on here, not just what is happening in North America. North America really doesn't matter that much in terms of the 13 colonies of the British economy at this point. Canada matters more, the Caribbean far more. And that is the big problem. Economically, the Caribbean is far more important to the British than North America is. Germain doesn't realise almost until too late that his mucking around, and especially writing and sending off troops to different places and trying and delaying convoys and disrupting trade flows and causing and losing all these merchant ships because he's insisting on sailing solo, is causing him trouble until, well, the Battle of Grenada did start to make him think there was an issue. The Battle of Martinique is an issue. But when the Battle of Chesapeake happens, he realizes he's in trouble. But by that point, it's too late, and he will fall from power, as will Sandwich, at pretty much the same time. They will both go in roughly the same period, because they've been two sides of the same coin. One has done undoubtedly massive efforts, but in Sandwich's case, he'd also lost his wife, then he lost his long-term mistress, both died, and he retires basically from public life in 1782 and dies 10 years later. Spends 10 years in retirement at his big house in the country. And honestly, considering how much of his life he'd spent in public service, how much he'd spent as Lord of the Admiralty, he probably deserved it, and the work he'd done. There is also another issue going on in this period, because the British are coppering their ships. And while they're coppering their ships, it does mean more out of service for longer while they're getting coppered. Once they're in service, they can be in service for a lot longer. Now, the coppering process is really implemented in full flow from about 1778 onwards. Now you're going to see the small problem coming up. If you start coppering ships and taking them out to copper them, once they're in service for longer, but this places extra effects on your fleet in terms of limitations of hull numbers. And one of the things we do see in this war is that the usual British effort of trying to make sure they had an advantage, a numerical advantage, as well as a training advantage, when they arrived at a battle in the 7 Years' War, hadn't always worked out away, but they tried that, consistently fails in the beginning of the Anglo-French War of 1778-83. And I should say that also you have the fact that the French are well placed to take advantage of this, because they have good officers. They have an experienced officer corps that has trained itself up, has developed itself. They've finally started to recover from the loss of the Huguenots, all the Protestant officers. They are getting back into a position where the French Navy is really, really viable, and as such, the British probably need to watch themselves more. Thankfully, the revolutionary wars in European revolutionary wars, thanks to what happens in France not that long later, will soon deal with that issue, but you You have to deal with it as it comes along. The Battle of Chesapeake is a bad battle. There are many, many issues with Graves' decisions, but mostly the problem is they waited too long to act, and when they acted, they didn't act with any strategic thought. The thing is, the British you can debate Graves' tactics to the nth degree, but the fact that the French coming out to fight and the British coming out to fight, and the British following the French fleet and keep following them, gave space for the French to sneak a fleet into the bay, could have also provided cover for a British fleet to sneak into the bay, or a British squadron to sneak into the bay with supplies for Yorktown. So the thing was a sensible commander thinking sensibly and strategically, and there were a few of those in the British command, and these are often less thought about scenarios. It's kind of like when we're talking about Taranto. Everyone talks about the attack on the Italian fleet in Taranto. On this channel I specifically did a whole video about all the convoys and all the wider operation going on around Taranto, with ships being passed backwards and forwards, with merchant ships moving around, with all sorts of things going on around the Mediterranean as part of this overall operation, where the attack was one part of all sorts of moving whole. Yes, it's a glorious thing. It's a glorious battle. It's something we aspire to. It's great. Honestly, myself, I would prefer not to be in those swordfish, because let's be honest, the people in the observers sitting in the rear cockpit were waist deep in fuel as they flew, aviation fuel as they flew in, because the long-range fuel tanks fitted inside the cockpit for the torpedo bombers leaked and found a level inside the cockpit, the aft cockpit, which is where the observer and the tail air gunner, or telegraphist air gunner, usually sit. It's but only observer when you've got the long range cockpit, because basically the long range fuel goes into the observer's cockpit and they move back into the gunner's seat. So great thing, but there's a whole wider operation going on. Conceiving of operations like that, a good example is the resupply of Gibraltar at various points, which breaks the siege there, etc. That's what you need from an admiral at a strategic level. And there is a difference between commanders who are commander-in-chiefs versus admirals, and the Royal Navy starts to learn this very quickly, that political connections don't necessarily help in this matter. That just because you're an admiral doesn't mean you have necessarily the ingredients to be a commander-in-chief. And it takes a while to develop out this, but then you have the Battle of Saints in 1782. And this is in many ways the Royal Navy coming back. The Royal Navy have been out of sorts for the first 4 years of the war in many regards. They have really not been performing as they would expect you to have, and you have lost, as a result, sea power. But by 1782, many of the issues for the Admiralty have been turned around, many of the domestic supply issues, and the issues between Lord Germain's department and them have been, I wouldn't say resolved, but have been functionally dealt with. And you have the Royal Navy's gone through its admirals, and they've worked out who is a good commander-in-chief and who is a good admiral. And they've realised there is a difference. And one of the interesting things about Saints versus Chesapeake is that you have Drake and Hood are the junior commanders in both battles. In both battles, they are the junior commanders. But in this scenario, you have Rodney instead of Graves in charge. And that makes the difference. Because you have, for want of a better word, the phraseology, a commander-in-chief. Now, what is the difference between that and an admiral? It's thinking about things on a strategic level. Because An admiral, in many ways, can be trained. And you can also train someone to be a commander-in-chief if you have enough time and you want to put them through enough courses to do it. But it's different. Being able to lead a fleet and technically run a battle group and fight a battle is something you can be trained and drilled for and grow up to and attain your whole life. Working out where that battle group needs to be, how best to use multiple battle groups, where best to deploy them around the world to achieve your strategic aims, that is a different skill set. And commanders who are good at one are not necessarily good at the other because they're human. And humans are not good at everything. There are a small minority of us, a very small minority of us as a species, who are amazing at everything. But they are few and far between. They really are. So you have to find the people who are good at things and let them go to those things. It's also, I would say personally, one of those issues I get into when people start going, well, yes, you should only join the military if you're a guy, not a girl, and all these things. There are certain points in life where a healthy dose of pack mule in your DNA are helpful. But even in this period we're talking about, the intellectual requirements of an admiral, of a commander-in-chief, are far greater than we give them credit for. And often they are very slight or very old people. They are not doing physically strenuous things. That's not their job. Their job isn't there to fight the battle and be the stunning Hollywood hero. Their job is there to fight the battle with this. And you need someone who's good with this to win. And perhaps that's tougher to get across. Perhaps that's a cultural history thing that we sort of find more difficult to get across, because it's so much easier to lionize a hero who does the brave and daring thing, who jumps into the breach, who cons the ship through a mighty storm, all these things. It's easy to see that as a physical heroism. It's easy to focus in on that and lionize that, and ask people to emulate that. It's far more difficult to talk about someone spending hours and days poring over maps and documents and sifting through information to try and come to some sort of idea of what their opponent's going to do, so they can shift the pieces around like chess pieces in a way on a global board and hope they're positioned right. That's boring. That doesn't make for a cool movie. That doesn't make for a cool story down the pub. What do you do today? Spent hours in the office staring at papers. It's necessary. It's critical. But it's boring. And this is the other point I wanted to put in this. The Great Siege of Gibraltar. Yeah. This takes place during this war, during the Anglo-French War, when the Spanish join in. It's the longest siege in Gibraltar's history. And as I've covered on this channel, you have a glorious meeting of very, very good commanders and the necessary equipment and supplies in the right place at the right time. And the British win. It's a close run thing, but the British win. when they've lost sea control at several of those points, when they've lost the dominion of the seas. Because, again, sea power is not, and having the control of the seas is not just an end into itself. It's a means to an end. If you have control of the sea, you then have to be able to use that control of the sea. That's what the British did in the 7 Years' War. They used their sea power to dance around everyone else and go and take their colonies and take the rich parts of their empires and go, woohoo, we got it. Or secure Britain's own rich part of its empires. That was it. That was the critical thing. So, Britain losing sea power doesn't necessarily look like how we would imagine it losing sea power. Because you also have to, the opponents have to then be able to take advantage of that loss of sea power to go and do those things. And one of the problems for the French was when the British lost sea power, they lost control. You could argue they lost control of the coast of North America completely for several periods. In that period, they lost dominance in the Caribbean at several points in that period. They lost control of the Mediterranean at several points in that period. All this they lost. At no point did they lose control. Did the Western Squadron lose control of the Channel in that period? It came. There was some scares, but it was powerful the whole way through. At no point did the French really have the opening they'd had. Well, at several points over the years when they've tried to invade the British Isles. At no point did they have that. Which brings us to our next scenario where the British lost sea power, because this is important because this is where they did lose it, where it matters. They lost it around the UK. Why? Because of the Spithead and Nore mutinies. The Spithead mutiny encompassed 31 ships. 31 ships at a line. That's a pretty big fleet in terms of ships and available ships at the time. Spithead mutiny was over pay. It was over things like the Pusser's Pound, where the Pusser, by tradition, due to spoilage, due to their own pay systems, instead of giving 16 ounces on the pound, would give 14 ounces on the pound and retain 2 ounces. So the men didn't feel they were getting the proper food. Pay dispute was because, frankly, the British hadn't upped the pay in over 100 years. It had been fine for a long while because it had been stable. But inflation had hit, especially after a certain war of American Revolutionary War and that sort of period. And so, unsurprisingly, a few years later, there is a mutiny because the pay is no longer equitable to the situation. At Spithead, they have to get the victor of the glorious 1st of June, Admiral Howe, to come down and confirm the negotiations. They get pardoned for their mutinies. The whole point they offered, if the French came out to sea, they would go to sea to fight them. At no point did they say they wouldn't fight the French, which was important. And they got their pay increase, and they got the Pusser's Pound abolished. There was no real problem with it. It was, in many ways, more of a strike. A refusal to go to sea than it was a mutiny. Especially as they still allowed ships to go to sea if they were doing convoy duties or various other things like that. They didn't disrupt that at all. As a result, this is held up often as an honourable mutiny and as the way to conduct things. And it's an interesting one. It does become kind of a template for how naval personnel, when they felt the need to mutiny, since have tried to act. But still, for a longer period than anyone would like to think, in April and May, the Royal Navy, the Channel Squadron, the squadron which is in charge of watching A, the back of the Western Squadron, and B, all the ports of the French on the Channel coast, didn't have 31 ships available to it. That was scary. Luckily, the French didn't realise they weren't being watched, and so didn't do anything. But they were so used to the British being there, there's an argument they didn't actually even notice the British weren't there. They just presumed they were there and just couldn't see them. There again, there is a testimony to naval superiority. The psychology of your opponent. Your opponent's got so used to them being there, you being there, and you being superior to them, they don't even notice when you're not there. It's, I don't know, blockade by psychology going on. Nor was a different factor. If you go back to this, you'll see that Nor takes place on a Thames estuary. And, well, they took on some very different political tones, and there's some very different issues. They also, at several points, try and preserve their cohesion by firing on other ships when they're not doing what they want to do. Doesn't work. They also try and blockade London. That doesn't really work. They try and demand peace to be made with France. That really doesn't work. And the thing is, they want to not. Their leadership tries to not accept the deal which had already been agreed with the people at Spithead. Whereas it turns out the vast majority of the mutineers were quite happy with the Spithead resolution and didn't understand why their leadership weren't. But Nor caused more problems, in a way, than Spithead did. Nor caused problems in that it fundamentally altered some of the ideas which had been present in the Royal Navy about the personnel they were dealing with. Yes, there'd always been a worry about the United Irishmen and the sheer number of Irish sailors in the Royal Navy, but that was not as big a factor. What became a bigger factor as a result of Nor was a realization that the officers had to do more to look after the sailors. Because very quickly, the officers, especially who got back into control of these ships afterwards, and these ships are some of the ships which take part in Camperdown, etc. They realise and they put forward to the Admiralty, and this sort of goes through, that, well, there had been pay rises for the officers. There hadn't been pay rises for the sailors, mostly because prize money was considered so generous. But the thing was, by this point in the Age of Sail Wars, prize money you get if you're a frigate captain, not you get prize money. Because you'll be out taking merchant ships, you'll be out taking blockades, fighting other frigates, all sorts of thrilling actions. It's brilliant fun. But ships of the line don't. And when you've combined this with coppering hulls, so they get less time in port because you need less maintenance, so you can go for maintenance less frequently and you can take less time doing it because the hulls have been coppered, they get less leave. So they're on the same pay with less leave, so their quality of life is different, and they've got a very low chance of getting prize money because they are mostly manning the ships of the line, which mostly only get to take part in the big battles when they come up, and they are rare, versus the small ship actions and the hunting down merchant ships. Prize money only works as an incentive to make you put up with low pay and issues with food as long as you're going to get prize money. If you're not going to get it, it's no longer the incentive. It changed the relationship. It reaffirmed divisions as part of the Royal Navy, and divisions is when every sailor not only has the officer who's in command of their section, etc., they go to, and their petty officers, but they will also tend to have a divisional officer where it's sort of almost the ship's divided up into almost equal numbers, and there is a different junior officer for each one. So they can, they will have another officer they can go to. So if they have a problem with Officer A, they have Officer B they can go to and go, there's an issue going on, sir. Now, of course, there's many issues with that, but it works quite well. But there's also many informal methodologies of it going up. And that was the other realization, that to an extent the informal methods of officers being able to take the pulse of their crew hadn't worked as well. So there were a lot of lessons which came out of that. Now, if you've been listening to this video, you probably get the idea that when major powers, which are sea powers, lose control of the sea, it's usually down to internal factors more than external factors. And that is the case. Why? Infrastructure. To become a major sea power, you usually have to have invested in a massive amount of infrastructure. And as long as you're maintaining that infrastructure, it's very hard for others to catch up with you, unless they also choose to make a massive investment. And that's the problem for the French, to an extent the problem for the Spanish, and definitely the problem for the Dutch when it comes to fighting the British. The British can afford to spend massively on the navy and the infrastructure, as their army is mostly an expeditionary force they can deploy when they want to. For those other countries, they actually have land borders, ergo their army is something they actually have to have ready to fight on a regular basis. It's a problematic time, really. It's very, very annoying. How are you supposed to build up a nice navy if you keep having to use your army for stuff? It's just cruelty, really. Anyway, that's their broad speaking problem. Now, then, people then point at the United States and go, well, they have massive land borders. Yes, but the United States is the functional equivalent of a continent. For all intents and purposes, they are the functional equivalent of a continent. They can afford an army and navy, and you can argue because the sea is their border on two sides of the square, and that they are as embedded into the global financial system, if not necessarily the global movement of goods, as they are, Because again, they have quite so much ability for onshoring, and they have quite so much ability of resources onshore. To an extent, global movement of goods is less of a necessarily issue, but it's also more of an issue in other ways. As they are incentivized to be basically the global policeman, as Britain was during the age of empires. For Britain, why be the global navy? Why be the global policeman? Someone has to be. Someone has to enforce the rules and has to make some rules for everyone to work by. Why should Britain do it? Well, because it was financially necessary for Britain to do it because of the investment their global London, especially London as a financial centre, was dependent upon. And there is something else when looking back. Sometimes what we are faced with when we are dealing with sea power, in terms of British sea power and so on, we're dealing with the fact that we're peering back through a lot of Victorian era propaganda of the power of British naval sea power, and it being unassailable. It was never unassailable. But catching up with it required circumstances which no one else in the period was prepared to match, because they couldn't match. Britain was a fairly large landmass in comparison to others. It was as culturally united as any landmass at the time, and it was politically as united as any other landmass at the time, and it was economically and strategically incentivized to invest in the necessary infrastructure that could support its status and support its growing sea power capabilities. So it did. But those capabilities are still the subject to and can be exposed to issues of humanity, whether that's from the top or from the bottom. And you can argue the mutinies that they're sort of from the top, not forgetting about the bomb, but either way, whether it's from the top, a mismanagement from the top, and people having stupid political fights over things which disrupts the NATO, you better getting and keeping all the infrastructure going, or whether it's from people forgetting that pay rises are a thing in an era of inflation. It causes problems. Anyway, thank you for watching. I would add in a question here, but I honestly think there's going to be enough in here for people to discuss without me adding in a question at the end. But I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everyone, and the patron suggestions will be going live some point tomorrow for August 2023, and that is shocking to think that we are now in month 7. Right, no, month 8. We're almost in we're month in 7, and we're almost in month 8. Sheesh. The year. Where does the year go? Honestly, where does the year go? Thank you very much, Sharon. Take care.